This was the day for the bandages to be removed and the blue lenses fitted. The days had passed into weeks since her operation, and Marda West had lain there suffering no physical discomfort, but only the anonymity of darkness, a negative feeling that the world and the life around was passing her by. As for the operation itself, it had been successful, 100% successful. "You will see," the surgeon told her, "more clearly than ever before." "But how can you tell?" she urged, desiring her slender thread of faith to be reinforced. "Because we examined your eyes when you were under the anaesthetic," he replied, "and again since. We would not lie to you, Mrs. West." This reassurance came from them 2 or 3 times a day, and she had to steel herself to patience as the weeks wore by, so that she referred to the matter perhaps only once every 24 hours, and then by way of a trap, to catch them unawares. "Don't throw the roses out. I should like to see them," she would say. And the day nurse would be surprised into the admission, "They'll be over before you can do that," which meant that she would not see this week. And the subterfuge continued, the pretense that she did not mind and was content to wait. Even Jim, her husband, was no longer treated as a confidant. Once, long ago, every qualm and apprehension had been shared. This was before the operation. Then, fearful of pain and blindness, she had clung to him and said, "What if I never see again? What will happen to me?" And Jim, whose anxiety was no less harsh than hers, would answer, "Whatever comes, we'll go through it together." Now, for no known reason except that darkness perhaps had made her more sensitive, she was shy to discuss her eyes with him. During these days of waiting, she had the seed of fear that he, like the staff at the hospital, was being too kind. The kindness of those who knew towards the one who must not be told. Therefore, when at last it happened, when at his evening visit the surgeon said, "Your lenses will be fitted tomorrow," surprise was greater than joy. She could not say anything, and he had left the room before she could thank him. It was really true. The long agony had ended. "Tomorrow I shall see you," said Marda West, and the day nurse, with the cheerful laugh that could be heard sometimes down the corridor outside, answered, "Yes, I'll give you your first shock." It was strange how memories of coming into the nursing home were now blunted. The staff who had received her were dim shadows. Even the surgeon, brisk and efficient during those 2 rapid consultations when he had recommended an immediate operation, was a voice rather than a presence. "Aren't you feeling excited?" This was the low, soft voice of her night nurse, who, more than the rest of them, understood what she had endured. Nurse Brand, by day, exuded a daytime brightness. She was a person of sunlight, of bearing in fresh flowers, of admitting visitors. The night brought consolation and Nurse Ansell. She did not expect courage. At first, during the pain, it had been Nurse Ansell who had administered the drugs. It was she who had smoothed the pillows and held the glass to the parched lips. Then, with the passing weeks, there had been the gentle voice and the quiet encouragement. "It will soon pass. This waiting is the worst." At night, the patient had only to touch the bell, and in a moment Nurse Ansell was by the bed. How compassionate, that smooth, silken voice! The imagination, making fantasies through enforced rest, pictured some reality with Nurse Ansell that was not hospital. A holiday abroad, perhaps. The small shared intimacies of night-time brought a bond between nurse and patient that vanished with the day. And when she went off duty, she would whisper, "Until this evening," the very whisper stimulating anticipation, as though 8 o'clock that night would not be clocking in, but an assignation. Nurse Ansell understood complaint. When Marda West said wearily, "It's been such a long day," her answering, "Has it?" implied that for her, too, the day had dragged. It was with a special secret sympathy that she would announce the evening visitor. "Here's someone you want to see. A little earlier than usual." The tone suggesting that Jim was not the husband of 10 years, but a troubadour, a lover, someone whose bouquet of flowers had been plucked in an enchanted garden and now brought to a balcony. Shyly, the voice would murmur, "Good evening, Mr. West. Mrs. West is waiting for you." And Marda would hear the gentle closing of the door. It must have been during the 5th week that Marda West had tentatively suggested that perhaps when she returned home, the night nurse might go with them for the first week. "Would you like me to?" Reserve lay in the voice, yet promise, too. "I would. It's going to be so difficult at first." The patient, not knowing what she meant by difficult, saw herself as helpless still, in spite of the new lenses, and needing the protection and the reassurance that up to the present only Nurse Ansell had given her. "Jim, what about it?" His comment was something between surprise and indulgence. At least that was how it seemed to Marda West. And later, when he had gone home, she said to the night nurse, "I can't make out whether my husband thought it a good idea or not." The answer was quiet, yet reassuring. "Don't worry. Mr. West is reconciled." But reconciled to what? The change in routine? 3 people round the table, conversation, the unusual status of a guest who, devoting herself to her hostess, must be paid. "Aren't you feeling excited?" Nurse Ansell, by the pillow, touched the bandages, and it was the warmth in the voice, the certainty that only a few hours now would bring revelation, which stifled at last all lingering doubt of success. The operation had not failed. Tomorrow she would see once more. "In a way," said Marda West, "it's like being born again. Tomorrow you won't be a voice to me anymore. You'll be a person." "Aren't I a person now?" A note of gentle teasing, of pretended reproach, which was all part of the communication between them, so soothing to the patient. "Well, yes, of course, but it's bound to be different." "I don't see why." Even knowing she was dark and small, for so Nurse Ansell had described herself, Marda West must be prepared for surprise at the first encounter. "Look, feel." And not for the first time, Nurse Ansell took her patient's hand and passed it over her own face. A little embarrassing, perhaps, because it implied surrender, the patient's hand a captive. Marda West, withdrawing it, said with a laugh, It doesn't tell me a thing." "Sleep, then. Tomorrow will come too soon." There was always a slight sense of loss, of loneliness, as the door closed and she went away, and a feeling of jealousy, too, because there were other patients who received these same mercies. When she awoke, and this often happened in the small hours, Marda West would no longer picture Jim at home, but would have an image of Nurse Ansell, seated perhaps by someone's bed, bending to give comfort, and this alone would make her reach for the bell and press her thumb upon it. Well, we can't complain of the weather. Now it was the day itself, and Nurse Brand coming in like the first breeze of the morning. "All ready for the great event?" she asked. "We must get a move on, and keep your prettiest nightie to greet your husband." First came the lifting of the bandages, the very slight prick of an injection to dull feeling. Then the surgeon did something to her eyelids. There was no pain. Whatever he did was cold, like the slipping of ice where the bandages had been, yet soothing too. "Now, don't be disappointed," he said. "You won't know any difference for about half an hour. Everything will seem shadowed, then it will gradually clear. I want you to lie quietly during that time." "I understand. I won't move." The longed-for moment must not be too sudden. This made sense. The dark lenses fitted inside her lids were temporary for the first few days. Then they would be removed and others fitted. "How much shall I see?" The question dared at last. "Everything, but not immediately in colour. Just like wearing sunglasses on a bright day. Rather pleasant." His cheerful laugh gave confidence, and when he and Nurse Brand had left the room, she lay back again, waiting for the fog to clear. Little by little, the mist dissolved. The first object was angular, a wardrobe, then a chair. Then, moving her head, the gradual forming of the window. "They weren't lying to me," she thought. "It's happened. It's true." The texture of the blanket covering her, so often felt, could now be seen as well. Colour was not important. The blue symmetry of vision itself was all important. To see, to feel, to blend the two together. It was indeed rebirth, the discovery of a world long lost to her. Even a prisoner, she decided, could find comfort in his cell if he had been blinded first and had recovered his sight. She heard Nurse Brand's voice outside and turned her head to watch the opening door. "Well, are we happy once more?" Smiling, she saw the figure dressed in uniform come into the room, bearing a glass of milk. Yet incongruous, absurd. The head, with the uniformed cap, was not a woman's head at all. The thing bearing down upon her was a cow. A cow on a woman's body. "Feeling a bit strange?" The laugh was a woman's laugh, Nurse Brand's laugh. The patient said nothing. She shut her eyes, then opened them again. The cow in the nurse's uniform was with her still. "Confess now," said Nurse Brand. "You wouldn't know you had the lenses in except for the colour." It was important to gain time. The patient stretched out her hand carefully for the glass of milk. The mask must be worn on purpose. Perhaps it was some kind of experiment connected with the fitting of the lenses, though how it was supposed to work she could not imagine. "I see very plainly," she said at last. "At least, I think I do." Nurse Brand stood watching her. "You don't sound too sure of yourself. Don't say you're disappointed after all we've done for you." "I'm sure of myself," answered her patient. "But I'm not so sure of you. Is it a trick?" "Is what a trick?" "The way you look, your face." Vision was not so dimmed by the blue lenses that she could not distinguish a change of expression. The cow's jaw distinctly dropped. "Really, Mrs. West." This time the laugh was not so cordial. "I'm as the good God made me. I dare say he might have made a better job of it." The cow moved from the bedside towards the window and drew the curtains more sharply back, so that the full light flooded the room. There was no visible join to the mask. The head blended to the body. "I didn't mean to offend you," she said, "but it is just a little strange. You see—" She was spared explanation because the door opened and the surgeon came into the room. At least the surgeon's voice was recognizable as he called,
Hello? How goes it?
But that terrier's head, ears pricked, the inquisitive searching glance. This time the patient laughed. The effect was ludicrous. It must be a joke. It had to be. But why go to such expense and trouble? The cow shrugged its too ample shoulders. "Mrs. West thinks us a bit of a joke," she said.
"I'm all for that," said the surgeon. "It would never do if she took a dislike to us, would it?"
Then he came and bent close to observe her eyes. She lay very still. He wore no mask either, none, at least, that she could distinguish. "Your name ought to be Jack Russell," she said aloud.
"I beg your pardon?"
"I mean," Marda West searched for words, "the name seems to suit you better than your own."
"Well, I know a James Russell," he said to her, "but he's an orthopedic surgeon."
His voice was brisk, but he sounded a little surprised, as Nurse Brand had done. The gratitude which was owed to their skill was not forthcoming.
"Well, nurse," he went on, "the patient can do everything within reason, except remove the lenses. You've warned her, I suppose?"
"I was about to, sir, when you came in." He turned his pointed terrier nose to Marda West.
"I'll be in on Thursday to change the lenses. In the meantime, it's just a question of washing out the eyes with a solution 3 times a day. They'll do it for you. Don't touch them yourself. The patient did that once and lost his sight. He never recovered it."
"If you tried that," the terrier seemed to say, "you would get what you deserved. Better not make the attempt. My teeth are sharp." "I understand," said the patient slowly. The terrier was saying something to the cow, giving instructions, and the foolish head nodded in answer. As they moved to the door, the patient made a last attempt. "Will the permanent lenses be the same as these?"
"Exactly the same," yapped the surgeon, "except that they won't be tinted. You'll see the natural colour. Until Thursday, then."
He was gone, and the nurse with him. What happened now? If it really was some kind of test, did they remove their masks instantly? It seemed to Marda West of immense importance that she should find this out. She slipped out of bed and went to the door. She could hear the surgeon say,
1½ grains. She's a little overwrought. It's the reaction, of course."
Bravely, she flung open the door. They were standing there in the passage, wearing the masks still. "Do you want anything, Mrs. West?" asked Nurse Brand. Marda West stared beyond them down the corridor. The whole floor was in on the deception. A maid, carrying dustpan and brush, had a weasel's head, and the nurse, advancing from the other side, was a little prancing kitten, the doctor beside her a proud lion. Even the porter, arriving at that moment in the lift opposite, carried a boar's head between his shoulders. The first sharp prick of fear came to Marda West. How could they have known she would open the door at that minute? How could they have arranged to walk down the corridor wearing masks? Nurse Brand, the cow, took hold of her and led her back into her room. "Are you feeling all right, Mrs. West?" she asked anxiously. Marda West climbed slowly into bed. If it was a conspiracy, what was it all for? "I'm rather tired," she said. "I'd like to sleep." "That's right," said Nurse Brand. "You got a wee bit excited." She was mixing something in the medicine glass, and this time, as Marda West took the glass, her hand trembled. She lay down on her pillow, and Nurse Brand drew the curtains. "Now just relax," she said, "and when you wake up, you'll feel so much better." The heavy head stretched forward. In a moment it would surely open its jaws and moo. The sedative acted swiftly.
Already a drowsy sensation filled the patient's limbs. She awoke, not to the sanity she had hoped for, but to lunch brought in by the kitten. "How long must it go on for?" asked Marda West. "How do you mean, Mrs. West?" asked the kitten, smiling. Such a flighty little thing, with its pursed-up mouth. "This test on my eyes," said the patient. "I don't see the point of it." "I'm sorry, Mrs. West," the kitten said. "I don't follow you. Did you tell Nurse Brand you couldn't see properly yet?" "It's not that I can't see," replied Marda West. "I see perfectly well, but why do you look like a kitten, and a tabby kitten at that?" Perhaps she sounded ungracious. The nurse, Marda West remembered the voice. It was Nurse Sweeting, and the name suited her. Drew back from the trolley table. "I'm sorry," she said, "if I don't come up to scratch. I've never been called a cat before." "I'm not making it up," said the patient. "I see what I see. You are a cat, and Nurse Brand's a cow." This time the insult must sound deliberate. Nurse Sweeting's whiskers bristled. "If you please, Mrs. West," she said, "will you eat your chicken and ring the bell when you're ready for the next course?" She stalked from the room. No, they could not be wearing masks. The kitten's surprise and resentment had been too genuine. And the staff of the hospital could not possibly put on such an act for one patient. The fault must lie in the lenses. A sudden thought struck her. She climbed out of bed and went over to the dressing table. Her own face stared back at her from the looking-glass. The dark lenses concealed the eyes, but the face was at least her own. "Oh, thank heaven for that," she said to herself. But it swung her back to thoughts of trickery. That her own face should seem unchanged through the lenses suggested a plot. But why? Could there be a conspiracy amongst them to drive her mad? She dismissed the idea at once. It was too fanciful. Besides, if they wanted to send her mad, or kill her even, it would be simple enough with drugs. She would try one further proof. She stood by the window and watched for passers-by. It was the lunch hour, and traffic was slack. Then a van drew near, but she could not see the driver. Yes, he slowed as he went by the nursing home, and she saw the squat frog's head, the bulging eyes. Sick at heart, she left the window and climbed back into bed. After a while the door opened. It was not the kitten. It was the little maid with the weasel's head. "Will you have plum tart or ice cream, madam?" she asked. Marda West, her eyes half closed, shook her head. The weasel, shyly edging forward to take the tray, said, "Cheese, then, and coffee to follow?" The head joined the neck without any fastening. It could not be a mask. "Coffee only," said Marda West. The weasel vanished. Another knock on the door, and the kitten was back again, her back arched. She plonked the coffee down without a word, and Marda West, irritated, for surely if anyone was to show annoyance it should be herself, said sharply, "Shall I pour you some milk in the saucer?" The kitten turned. "A joke's a joke, Mrs. West," she said, "and I can take a laugh with anyone, but I can't stick rudeness." "Meow," said Marda West. The kitten left the room. Marda went to the telephone and asked the exchange to put her through to her husband's office. As luck had it, he was there. "Oh, Jim, darling." "Yes?" The relief to hear the loved, familiar voice. "Darling, when can you get here?" "Not before this evening, I'm afraid. It's one hell of a day." "Well, how did it go? Is everything okay?"
Not exactly.
What do you mean? Can't you see?
How was she to explain what had happened to her? It sounded so foolish over the telephone. Yes, I can see perfectly. It's just that all the nurses look like animals. And the surgeon, too. One of those little Jack Russells they put down the fox's holes.
What on earth are you talking about?
Marda West knew it was no use. She must wait till he came. Then she would try to explain, and he would be able to find out for himself what lay behind it. "Oh, well, never mind," she said. "I'll tell you later."
"I'm sorry," he told her, "but I really am in a tearing hurry. If the lenses don't help, tell somebody, tell the nurses, the matron."
"Yes," she said, "yes."
Marda West closed her eyes. She opened them again. She closed them once more. If the chair had become a mushroom and the table a haystack, then the blame could have been put upon the lenses. Why was it only people who had changed? The curious day dragged on, and she waited restlessly for 8 o'clock. A strange feeling of nervousness had come upon her. She realized, so strange had been the day, that she had not once thought about Nurse Ansell. Dear, comforting, bewitching Nurse Ansell. Nurse Ansell, who was due to come on duty at 8. Was she also in the conspiracy? If she was, then Marda West would have a showdown. Nurse Ansell would never lie. She would go up to her, and put her hands on her shoulders, and take the mask in her 2 hands, and say to her, "There, now take it off, you won't deceive me." But if it was the lenses, if all the time it was the lenses that were at fault, how was she to explain it? She was sitting at the dressing table, putting some cream on her face, and the door must have opened without her being aware. But she heard the well-known voice, the soft, beguiling voice, and it said to her, "I nearly came before. I didn't dare. You would have thought me foolish." It slid slowly into view. The long snake's head, the twisting neck, the pointed barbed tongue, swiftly thrusting and swiftly withdrawn. It came into view over her shoulders, through the looking-glass. Marda West did not move. Only her hand, mechanically, continued to cream her cheek. The snake was not motionless. It turned and twisted all the time, as though examining the pots of cream, the scent, the powder. How does it feel to see yourself again? Nurse Ansell's voice emerging from the snake's head seemed all the more grotesque and horrible. Marda West felt sickness rise in her stomach, choking her. She turned away, but as she did so, the steady hands of the nurse gripped her. She suffered herself to be led to her bed, eyes closed. Poor dear, it's been too much for you. The gentle voice, so soothing and so calm, could only belong to one who understood. "We can't have Mr. West seeing you like this. I've half a mind to telephone him to stay away." "No, please. I want to see him. I must see him." Fear made her open her eyes, but directly she did so, the sickness gripped her again, for the snake's head was twisting out of its nurse's collar. A sound came from Nurse Ansell, expressing disquiet. "Something has turned you very sick," she said. "What was the dinner this evening?" "Steamed fish. I wasn't hungry." "I wonder if it was fresh. I'll see if anyone has complained. Meanwhile, lie still, dear, and don't upset yourself." The door quietly opened and closed again. Now Marda was certain that what was happening was real, was true. Some evil force encompassed the nursing home and its inhabitants. They were all partners in some gigantic crime, the purpose of which could not be understood. One thing was certain. She must not let them know that she suspected them. One slip and she was lost. The door opened, and Nurse Ansell was back. Marda West forced a smile.
"What a nuisance I am," she said. "I felt giddy, but I'm better now." The gliding snake held a bottle in her hand. She came over to the wash basin and, taking the medicine glass, poured out 3 drops. This should settle it, Mrs. West. Fear gripped the patient once again, for surely the words themselves constituted a threat. This should settle it. Settle what? She took the medicine glass handed to her and invented a subterfuge. "Could you find me a clean handkerchief in the drawer there?" "Of course." The snake turned its head, and as it did so, Marda West poured the contents of the glass onto the floor. Then, fascinated, repelled, she watched the twisting head peer into the contents of the drawer, search for a handkerchief, and bring it back again. "Tell me," the voice said, "are you disappointed? Do I look as you expected me to look? A trap. She must be careful." "I think you do," Marda said slowly. "But it's difficult to tell with the cap. I can't see your hair." Nurse Ansell laughed, the low, soft laugh that had been so alluring during the long weeks of blindness. She put up her hands, and in a moment the whole snake's head was revealed. "Do you approve?" she asked. Marda West forced herself to smile. "Very pretty," she said. "Very pretty indeed." "When I go home with you," said Nurse Ansell, "I needn't wear a uniform." Marda West felt suddenly cold. In the turmoil of the day, she had forgotten the plans. Nurse Ansell was to be with them for a week. It was all arranged. The vital thing was not to show fear. Nothing must seem changed. And then, when Jim arrived, she would tell him everything. If he could not see the snake's head, and indeed it was possible that he would not, if her hypervision was caused by the lenses, he must just understand that for reasons too deep to explain, she no longer trusted Nurse Ansell. The telephone rang on the bedside table, and Marda West seized it. It was her husband. "Sorry to be late," he said. "I'll jump into a taxi and be with you right away. The lawyer kept me." "Lawyer?" she asked. "Yes, you remember. About the trust fund." She had forgotten. There had been so many financial discussions before the operation. "Oh, yes. Was it satisfactory?" "I think so. I'll tell you directly." He rang off, and looking up she saw the snake's head watching her. "You must promise not to get too excited when Mr. West comes." "I'm not excited. I just long to see him, that's all." For the first time, Marda West had the impression that the snake was not entirely at its ease. It sensed tension. It knew, it could not help but know, that the atmosphere had changed between nurse and patient. The snake hovered at the end of the bed. Then, the tongue darting rapidly in and out, Nurse Ansell left the room. The taxi came at last. Jim's voice rang out in the street below. Her heart began to beat fast, and she watched the door. She heard his footstep outside, and then his voice again. He must be saying something to the snake. She would know at once if he had seen the head. He would come into the room either startled, not believing his eyes, or laughing, declaring it a joke. Why did he not hurry? Why must they linger there, talking, their voices hushed? The door opened. The familiar umbrella and bowler hat, the first objects to appear round the corner. Then the comforting, burly figure, but... Oh, God, no. Please, God. Not Jim, too, not Jim, forced into a mask, forced into an organisation of devils, of liars. Jim had a vulture's head. She lay in sick and speechless horror. "I gather you're not too well," he said, turning his vulture's head. "Feeling a bit out of sorts?" She was too numb to answer. She lay quite still as he approached the bed and bent to kiss her. The vulture's beak was sharp. "It's a reaction, Nurse Ansell says," he went on. The sudden shock of being able to see again. She says it will be much better when we get you home.
We? Nurse Ansell and Jim. The plan still held then. I don't know, she said faintly, but I want Nurse Ansell to come home.
Not want Nurse Ansell?
He sounded startled.
But it was you who suggested it.
There was no time to reply, as Nurse Ansell herself came into the room. Cup of coffee, Mr. West? It was the evening routine, yet tonight it sounded strange, as though it had been arranged outside the door.
Thanks, nurse, I'd love some. What's this nonsense about not coming home with us?
The vulture turned to the snake, and Marda West knew, as she watched them, that the plan for Nurse Ansell to come home had not been her own after all. She remembered now that the first suggestion had come from Nurse Ansell herself. It had come after Jim had spent the evening laughing and joking, and his wife had listened, her eyes bandaged, happy to hear him. Now, watching the smooth snake, she knew why Nurse Ansell wanted to return with her, and she knew too why Jim had not opposed it. The vulture opened its blood-stained beak.
Don't say you two have fallen out.
Impossible. The nurse looked sideways at the vulture. Mrs. West's just had a trying day, haven't you, dear? How best to answer? Neither must know. Neither the vulture nor the snake must ever know. I'm all right, Marda said. A bit mixed up. I'll be better in the morning. They would not destroy her. She had, for all her bewildered terror, the will to live. I won't bother you with these documents tonight, said the vulture. You can sign them at home. What documents? If she kept her eyes averted, she need not see the vulture's head. The voice was Jim's, steady and reassuring. The trust fund papers Forbes and Millwall gave me. They suggest I should become a co-director of the fund. The words struck a chord, a thread of memory. Something to do with her eyes. If the operation was not successful, she would have difficulty in signing her name. What for? She asked, her voice unsteady. After all, it is my money. He laughed. And turning to the sound, she saw the beak open. It gaped like a trap and then closed again. Of course it is, he said. That's not the point. The point is that I should be able to sign for you, if you should be ill or away. Marda West looked at the snake, and the snake, aware, shrank into its collar. Don't stay too long, Mr. West, murmured Nurse Ansell. Our patient must have a real rest tonight. She glided from the room, and Marda West was left alone with her husband, the vulture. I don't propose to go away, she said, or be ill. Probably not. These fellows always want safeguards. Anyway, I won't bore you with it now. Could it be that the voice was over-casual? That the hand, stuffing the document into the pocket of the greatcoat, was a claw? Did you really mean that? Jim asked. About Nurse Ansell? I don't know, she said. It seems to be rather silly to go home with a nurse, now that I can see again. He did not answer at once. The head sank deeper between the shoulders. I think she's a treasure, he said. And you're bound to feel groggy at first. I vote we stick to the plan. After all, if it doesn't work, we can always send her away. Perhaps, said his wife. She was trying to think if there was anyone left whom she could trust. A married brother in South Africa, friends in London, no one with whom she was intimate, not to this extent. She was quite alone, coldly conscious of the hatred and cruelty about her. Only 2 more days, thank goodness, said her husband. Then you'll be home again. But once back there with a vulture and a snake, would she not be more completely at their mercy than she was here? Did Grief say Thursday for certain? She asked. He told me so this morning when he telephoned. You'll have the other lenses then, the ones that show colour. The ones that would show the bodies, too. That was the explanation. The blue lenses only showed the heads. They were the first test. Greaves, the surgeon, was in this too, naturally. She sought wildly in her memory to try to recall a look, a sign, which would give her some insight into this dreadful plot, this conspiracy against her person or her sanity. "You look pretty peaky," he said suddenly. "I think I'd better go." He got up from the chair, a heavy, hooded figure, and she closed her eyes as he came to kiss her good night. The well-remembered kiss would have restored her, but not the stab of the vulture's beak, the thrusting, blood-stained beak. When he had gone, she began to moan, turning her head upon the pillow. The door opened again, and she put her hand to her mouth. They must not hear her cry. They must not see her cry. "How are you feeling, Mrs. West?" The snake stood at the bottom of the bed, and by her side the house physician. She had always liked him, a young, pleasant man, and although, like the others, he had an animal's head, it did not frighten her. It was a dog's head, an Aberdeen's. Long ago as a child she had owned an Aberdeen. "Could I speak to you alone?" she asked. "Of course. Do you mind, nurse?" He jerked his head at the door, and she had gone. "You'll think me very foolish," she began, "but it's the lenses. I can't get used to them." He came over, his head cocked in sympathy. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "They don't hurt you, do they?" "No," she said. "No, I can't feel them. It's just that they make everyone look strange." "They're bound to do that. They don't show colour." His voice was cheerful, friendly. "And you mustn't forget you're pulled about quite a bit. The nerves behind the eyes are still very tender." "Yes," she said. His voice, even his head, gave her confidence. "Have you known people who've had this operation before?" "Yes, scores of them. In a couple of days you'll be right as rain. You'll actually see more clearly in every way. One patient told me that it was as though she'd been wearing spectacles all her life, and then, because of the operation, she realised she saw all her friends and her family as they really were." "As they really were," she repeated. The Aberdeen nodded his head. "Mr. Greaves did a wonderful job on you. He was able to strengthen a nerve he thought had perished. He never had the use of it before, so who knows, Mrs. West, you may have made medical history. Anyway, sleep well, and the best of luck." He trotted from the room. The comforting words had turned to gall. In one sense they were a relief, because his explanation seemed to suggest there was no plot against her. She used the words he had used himself. Marda West could see people as they really were, and those whom she had loved and trusted most were in truth a vulture and a snake. The door opened, and Nurse Ansell entered the room. "Ready to settle down?" she asked. "Yes, thank you." There might be no conspiracy, but even so all trust, all faith were over. She watched the snake tuck in the sheet. Then the twisting neck peered closer. "Now, remember to ring your bell if you want anything." "I'll remember." The voice that had once seemed tender was over-smooth and false. How deceptive are ears, thought Marda West. What traitors to truth. And for the first time she became aware of her own new latent power. The power to tell truth from falsehood, good from evil. "Good night, Mrs. West." "Good night." Lying awake, her bedside clock ticking, Marda West decided upon her plan. She waited until 11 o'clock, an hour past the time when she knew that all the patients were settled and asleep. Then she crept out of bed and began to dress. When she was ready, she went to the door and softly turned the handle. All was quiet in the corridor. She looked to the left, where the nurse on duty sat. The snake was there, sitting crouched over a book. Marda West waited. She was prepared to wait for hours, and presently the sound she hoped for came, the bell from a patient. The snake lifted its head and checked the red light on the wall. Then she glided off down the corridor. Directly she had disappeared, Marda West left her own room and went to the head of the staircase. She listened carefully and then crept downstairs. In the main hall, she waited at the bottom of the stairway until she was certain of not being observed. She could see the night porter's back. His head was not visible, for he was bent over his desk, but when it straightened, she noticed the broad, fish face. She shrugged her shoulders. She had not dared all this way to be frightened by a fish. Boldly she walked through the hall. The fish was staring at her. "Do you want anything, madam?" he said. He was as stupid as she expected. She shook her head. "I'm going out. Good night." And she walked straight past him, out of the swing door and into the street. In the distance, Marda West saw the lights of Oxford Street. The friendly traffic drew her like a magnet, the distant lights, the distant men and women. When she came to Oxford Street, she paused, wondering of a sudden where she should go, whom she could ask for refuge. And it came to her once again that there was no one at all, because the couple passing her now, a toad's head on a short black body clutching a panther's arm, could give her no protection, and the policeman standing at the corner was a baboon. No one was human, no one was safe. She turned and ran, bumping into them. Seeing her run, they turned and looked at her, they screamed and yapped, they gave chase. Down Oxford Street she ran, alone in an animal world. "Lie quite still, Mrs. West. I'm not going to hurt you." She recognized the voice of Mr. Greaves, the surgeon, and dimly she told herself that they had got hold of her again. She was back at the nursing home. They had replaced the bandages over her eyes, and for this she was thankful. Such blessed darkness, the evil of the night hidden. "Now, Mrs. West, I think your troubles are over. No pain and no confusion with these lenses. The world's in colour again." The bandages were being removed. And suddenly everything was clear, was day, and the face of Mr. Greaves smiled down at her. At his side was a rounded, cheerful nurse. "Where are your masks?" asked the patient. "We didn't need masks for this little job," said the surgeon. "We were only taking out the temporary lenses." She let her eyes drift round the room. "Something happened to me, didn't it?" she said. "I tried to get away." The nurse glanced at the surgeon. He nodded his head. "Yes, you did. And frankly, I don't blame you. I blame myself. Those lenses I inserted yesterday were pressing upon a tiny nerve, and the pressure threw out your balance. That's all over now." His smile was reassuring, and the large, warm eyes of Nurse Brand, it must surely be Nurse Brand, gazed down at her in sympathy. "It was very terrible," said the patient. "I can never explain how terrible." The door opened, and the young physician entered. "Patient fully restored?" he asked. "I think so," said the surgeon. "What about it, Mrs. West?" Marda West stared gravely at the three of them. "I thought you were dogs," she said. "I thought you were a hunt terrier, Mr. Greaves, and that you were an Aberdeen." The house physician laughed. "But I am," he said. "It's my native town. Your judgment was not wholly out, Mrs. West. I congratulate you." Marda West did not join in the laugh. The doctors were moving towards the door, still laughing, and Marda West, sensing the normal atmosphere, said, "Who found me then? Who brought me back?" Mr. Greaves glanced back at her from the door. "You didn't get very far, Mrs. West. The porter followed you." "It's all finished with now," said the house physician. "The person who really had the full shock was poor Nurse Ansell when she found you weren't in your bed." Nurse Ansell. The revulsion of the night before was not so easily forgotten. "Don't say our little starlet was an animal, too," smiled the house doctor. Marda West felt herself colour. Lies would have to begin. "No," she said quickly. "No, of course not." "Nurse Ansell is here now," said Nurse Brand. "She was so upset when she went off duty that she wouldn't go back to the hostel. Would you care to have a word with her?" Apprehension seized the patient, but before she could answer, the house doctor called down the passage, "Mrs. West wants to say good morning to you." Mr. Greaves waved his hand and was gone. Nurse Brand went after him, and the house doctor stepped back against the wall to admit Nurse Ansell. Marda West stared, then tremulously began to smile, and held out her hand. How could she have seen Nurse Ansell as a snake? The hazel eyes, the clear olive skin, the dark hair trim under the frilled cap, and that smile, that slow, understanding smile. Patient and nurse held hands. "I still don't understand what happened," she said, clinging to the nurse. "Mr. Greaves tried to explain something about a nerve." Nurse Ansell made a face towards the door. "He doesn't know himself," she whispered. "And he's not going to say either, or he'll find himself in trouble." She looked down at her patient. She was so pretty, so gentle. "Don't think about it," she said. "You're going to be happy from now on. Promise me?" "I promise," said Marda West. The telephone rang, and Nurse Ansell reached for the receiver. "You know who this is going to be," she said. "Your poor husband." She gave the receiver to Marda West. "Jim? Jim, is that you?" The loved voice sounding so anxious at the other end. "Are you all right?" he said. "What the devil's been happening?" Marda West smiled and handed the receiver to the nurse. "You tell him," she said. Nurse Ansell held the receiver to her ear. "Is that you, Mr. West?" she said. "Our patient gave us a fright, didn't she? Well, you don't have to worry any more. Mr. Greaves changed the lenses. They were pressing on a nerve, but everything's now all right. He said we could come home tomorrow." Marda West reached once more for the receiver. "Jim, I had a hideous night," she said. "I'm only just beginning to understand it now. A nerve in the brain." "So I gather," he said. "Thank God they've traced it. That fellow Greaves can't have known his job." "Can't happen again," she said. "Now the proper lenses are in, it can't happen again." "It had better not," he said, "or I'll sue him. How are you feeling?" "Wonderful," she said. "Bewildered, but wonderful." "Good girl," he said. "Don't excite yourself. I'll be along later." His voice went. Marda West gave the receiver to Nurse Ansell. "Did Mr. Greaves really say I could go home tomorrow?" she asked. "Yes, if you're good." Nurse Ansell smiled. "Are you sure you still want me to come with you?" "Why, yes," said Marda West. "It's all arranged." She sat up in bed, and the sun came streaming through the window, throwing light on the roses, the lilies, the tall-stemmed iris. "The most precious thing in the world," she said, "is sight. I know now. I know what I might have lost." Nurse Ansell nodded her head in sympathy. "You've got your sight back," she said. "That's the miracle. You won't ever lose it now." She moved to the door. "I'll slip back to the hostel and get some rest. Is there anything you want before I go?" "Give me my lipstick," said the patient, "and the brush and comb." Nurse Ansell fetched the things from the dressing table. She brought the hand mirror too, and the bottle of scent, and with a little smile of intimacy sniffed at the stopper. "Oh, gorgeous," she murmured. "This is what Mr. West gave you, isn't it?" Already, thought Marda West. Nurse Ansell fitted in. "I'll be with you at 8 o'clock. The familiar words, said every morning now for so many days and weeks, sounded in her ear like a melody, loved through repetition. At last they were joined to the individual, the one whose eyes promised friendship and loyalty. "See you this evening." The door closed. Nurse Ansell had gone. Marda West took the stopper from the scent bottle and put it behind her ears. She lifted the hand mirror and looked into it. Nothing changed in the room. The street noises penetrated from outside, and presently the little maid, who had seemed a weasel yesterday, came in to dust the room. She said, "Good morning," but the patient did not answer. Perhaps she was tired. The maid dusted and went her way. Then Marda West took up the mirror and looked into it once more. No, she had not been mistaken. The eyes that stared back at her were doe's eyes, wary before sacrifice, and the timid deer's head was meek, already bowed.